Finally face to face with the man who had a hand in killing two of his brothers, Choso is able to best our protagonist and is but a step away from getting his revenge. However, with Yuji on the verge of death and the fight all but done, with everything but the nail in the coffin being struck, a surreal scene, to say the least, is painted for the reader, and indeed our victor. At that moment, a memory was born inside Choso's brain of a past event that never happened. Choso is now breaking bread with his two deceased brothers Eso and Kichizu, 6 remaining brothers still in their unincarnated form, let's call it, and the very man he was about to kill is now passing him the breadbasket. Unable to comprehend the situation, Choso is left in a state of mania, having to walk away from the fight and left asking, why? Why indeed? Today we take a look at what happened here and the possible implications of a hidden power for our lovable and down-to-earth protagonist. Something separate from the mysterious yet obvious superhuman physical ability and his newfound friend now residing within his body. At first glance, something seemingly very powerful, if not perhaps a little innocent and harmless though. However, the details paint a picture of something potentially quite dangerous and even a little sinister. Suffice to say, something very fitting with the namesake of the series, Yuji's Curse. Domo, what is up everybody? Welcome to the Steady Studios YouTube channel. My name is Steady. I am the official Jujutsu Kaisen manga translator. I thought I'd go ahead and do a little bit of a Nanami cosplay here. This is first time I've done cosplay since, you know, like dressing up for Halloween and stuff like that. So that was years ago. But I thought, you know, with everything that's going on in the anime right now, you know, and my favorite character finally seeing the spotlight for the world to see, I thought I'd pay a little bit of homage. I did this for Halloween last month as well, so I figured I'd do it here. I even got the wig going on here. Not bad, eh? I know it's not quite Nanami style, but it'll do. For those of you that are regulars on the channel, thank you so much for coming back and spreading that positive juju with a like and a comment and all that good stuff. And those of you that are new, welcome. You are in one of the best places, if I do say so myself, for Jujutsu Kaisen content. I have weekly analysis videos of the chapters as well as weekly manga versus anime comparison videos. Where I take a look at where the anime and the manga sort of differentiate or where they stay the same. And I have a Jujutsu Kaisen podcast called Positive Juju as well. But enough about that. We are here today for a theories video. Those are always fun. And I figured it's about due time we talk about our main man himself, Yuji Itadori, right there. So I'll admit I'm not the first one to discover this, or, you know, I'm not the only one to say, oh my gosh, I think I'm onto something. Of course, a lot of people who read the series are well aware of this kind of phenomenon that we have with Yuji, this sort of memory manipulation ability that he seems to have. However, like I just said, this idea of memory manipulation gets tossed around, and it's always kind of a very one-dimensional explanation, you know, without actually even going into what the details are or why it exists or how it pertains to the story. So today I want to talk about it a little bit more in depth, especially Jujutsu Kaisen. We know that is far from being a one-dimensional series, so kind of the few of the things I want to talk about are its possible origins, where did this ability even come from, and how it pertains to Yuji's possible lineage. Also, the way that this ability even works, how it sort of activates the conditions that need to be met, the possible consequences, the negative effects that it has on Yuji and those around him, as well as something a little bit taboo. I'm going to be talking about the loopholes in my own theory. I think anytime people talk about theories, make theories videos, they always neglect to sort of touch on the loopholes, why it might not be true and why it's all just BS, what they've been saying for the last however many minutes. So I definitely like to talk about that, because I think it's important to talk about the loopholes, as it says, you know, it gives us an opportunity to say, okay, if we made a right turn and that's not quite the way to go, how about making a left turn? It kind of opens up the options and gets us to perhaps the truth. Also, I am the official manga translator. However, this is all just conjecture. I have not been, my position is not one where I'm given like the ending to the Jujutsu Kaisen, or I have direct contact with Akutami Sensei or something like that. That's not the case. So this, as far as where we are in the story, yeah, I'm aware a little bit ahead of time to get the chapter translated. But as far as like, I know the major story beats from here on out, that's not true at all. So just a little disclaimer there. I think a good place to start as any is to talk about the sort of possible origins, where this ability even came to be. Like, what is it? And of course we have to start by asking the question, is it Yuji at all? Because if we are to take the two sort of cases where we've seen this phenomenon happen, which are with Choso, right, in the Shibuya incident, as well as against Todo at the Goodwill event arc, if we're to take them separately, it's very hard to kind of say with confidence that it is indeed Yuji. But now that we have both cases, we're able to kind of put that common thread between the two, that it is Yuji, right? Because when it was first happened in the Goodwill event arc with Todo, it was funny because we were reading the chapter and we were telling ourselves, well, what's going on here? Is this some sort of comedic bit? Because we had Todo, you know, on the verge of victory, and then all of a sudden he has this memory sparked in his brain, and then they're junior high friends and this and that, and you're kind of like, is this just some sort of like Akutami Sensei comedy again? And I myself sort of wrote it off as that until we had the same event happen with Choso, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh my god, that thing that happened with Todo and them being brothers now is a huge story beat. So it was very, very interesting the way that it was sort of unraveled and revealed to us. So as far as answering the question, is it Yuji at all? I think we can say with confidence, yes. So if it is indeed Yuji, what is it? What is it about Yuji? How does it relate to Yuji? Is it Yuji's innate curse technique? And I think we can write this off, possibly. Kind of one of the main pieces of evidence to say that this isn't the case is that when Yuji was having his little watching movies training, which we saw very recently in the anime, Gojo mentions to Yuji that he doesn't have a curse technique. And based on what we know now in the manga, we can say with confidence that we can perhaps take this for word value. Very mysterious ability with Gojo's 6 eyes. We don't know the full picture of what the 6 eyes are really all about. However, we do know that he has this insane ability where he's able to discern a target's curse technique and sort of use that to his advantage. We saw that in the flashback arc where he was fighting against that kind of guy with the bag over his head, the guy that kind of looks like out of Resident Evil 4, and he was able to say, oh, your ability is kind of cloning yourself and this and that and the ins and outs. He even knew the ins and outs of how it works and the sort of advantages and disadvantages of an ability like that. And he even mentions my 6 eyes allow me to do that. So if we're to take this ability that Gojo has as fact, then the fact that he looks at Yuji and says, sorry dude, you don't have one as of right now, we can perhaps take that as some sort of word value. However, it's definitely worth mentioning, well, what if it's something that was latent within Yuji and it didn't really activate until Gojo had this little moment with Yuji? And the idea of activating someone's latent curse technique is extremely rare, and it's been touched on a few times in the series. The only other time that we've seen it so far is with Junpei and Mahito. Mahito, obviously a master manipulator of the soul, and he was able to forcibly activate this latent curse technique within Junpei, and all of a sudden he can use telekinesis and he can summon this Shikigami, this jellyfish dredge kind of Shikigami. And that's not to say that this didn't happen possibly with Yuji. However, there was nothing really to suggest between the time that Gojo made the decision that he doesn't have a curse technique and the Goodwill event when he fought Todo to say something different happened to him to activate this latent curse technique within him. So we can say perhaps that it's not a curse technique which Yuji is supposed to have. So is it Sukuna's ability then? Probably not. Gojo, like I just mentioned, says that Yuji doesn't have a curse technique, although he will eventually inherit Sukuna's. But what we know of Sukuna's curse technique now is more of this kind of slashing ability, and even to the next level when he uses his domain expansion, we have this beautiful display of just infinite slashes, right? And there is kind of suggestions that saying that Sukuna perhaps has some sort of connection with poisons as well, which is why Yuji is sort of immune to poisons when he fought against Junpei, for example, and when he fought against Kechizu and Eso as well, right? He wasn't affected by the Wing King. And the definitive piece of evidence to suggest that Sukuna is not involved with this memory manipulation ability, let's call it for right now, is the fact that when it activated against Choso, there was clear surprise on Sukuna's face. He didn't have an idea of what was going on. Suggesting that Sukuna has something to do with it is kind of a hard sell, if you ask me. So what does that leave us with? We have to kind of take a look at what Jujutsu Kaisen is all about. It's about curses, right? So we've seen this example of an outside force, a curse being put on someone and then being able to gain abilities. The only other time that we've seen this is with Volume 0. Now I know that the English version of Volume 0 is not out yet, but it is coming out in January, so it is right around the corner. So it's very exciting news. And I won't get into too much detail for the fact that it's not out officially in English yet. However, we do have to touch on it a little bit for the sake of this theory. Volume 0 follows heavily the kind of origins of Yuta Okkotsu, who is the 4th second year at Tokyo Jujutsu High. Sort of the mysterious one that we don't know too much about if we're talking about just the main story so far. We know Maki, Toge, and Panda, and then there's this kind of 4th, really strong, really mysterious kind of special grade, right? Jujutsu Sorcerer to go along with Gojo and Geto and Tsukumo. And the whole thing with Yuta is that he was able to gain this sublime abilities from the curse which he is dwelling within his body, which is Rika, right? He's basically granted bottomless cursed energy and the ability to copy anyone's curse technique unconditionally, so extremely strong, obviously. So without going into too much more detail than that, we have been shown the evidence that a sorcerer can gain abilities from sort of an outside force, a curse, so to speak. And in the case of Yuta, it is an actual entity this entity called Rika. So could this be the case with Yuji, that he was sort of cursed by someone and given this outside force? And yes, I do think that this is definitely possible, especially with the nature of the series. Again, we have to remind ourselves this is a manga about curses. So who would be the one to have cursed him, right? And I use this word curse sort of lightly because it's very esoteric in the story as well, right? A curse can be an actual entity, a curse can actually be like a power, and all sorts of different things. We have to look back at chapter 1, and not only chapter 1, but the very first few pages of chapter 1 as well. And if we're talking about the anime, very much the first few minutes, the scene with the grandfather. So the grandfather, obviously, in his final moments, wants to talk to Yuji and leaves him with his dying wish, his final words. He hopes that his grandson is able to avoid the fate that he has unfortunately seen, where he's dying alone, only with his grandson by his side. And he tells Yuji, you're a strong kid, so go out there and help people. Don't expect anything in return. You don't have to help everyone, but do what you can. And then when it's your time to go, be surrounded by those that are dear to you. And perhaps this was a sly move by Akutami Sensei, where the grandfather was actually cursing Yuji, left him with this kind of final will, so to speak, passing on this will to Yuji quite literally. And later on in the chapter, Yuji even says himself, when he's fighting the curse, I've got quite the curse myself. Now, of course, this could be kind of more of a tongue-in-cheek kind of moment by Akutami Sensei, saying that, hey, he says it kind of as a joke, but perhaps it is actually true. And it's also worth mentioning that the grandfather, his name was revealed in the anime to be Wasuke. Now, this isn't any official confirmation, however, the kanji suggests that his name is indeed Wasuke. And it's significant because wa in Wasuke is kind of the old style of referring to Japan. And ske is to help. So helping Japan is how we can take this name to mean and how it pertains to the story. So perhaps very, very significant. This wish for Yuji to help those in Japan, help others. Now, how does this whole wish really relate to the ability which Yuji has? At first glance, it seems kind of unrelated, right? Well, okay, he wants his grandson to help as many people as possible and be surrounded by those he loves when he dies. How is that related to this mysterious memory manipulation ability? And this is why I keep on putting memory manipulation in quotes, because I think it's a little bit more than that. And I think that's the key detail that a lot of people miss when they mentioned this memory manipulation. In both cases, against Todo and Choso, Yuji is on the verge of death. And what if, in trying to make the grandfather's wish come true, something within him activates, and on death's doorstep, he's actually trying to increase the number of friends that are by his side as he says goodbye to this world. So perhaps memory manipulation is a little bit of a shallow description. We know that in Jujutsu Kaisen, the abilities get very, very complicated, and there's usually sort of a deeper meaning to things. So the complexity of the series may suggest that it's more than just memory manipulation. Perhaps it's more of kind of a forced friendship, which is seemingly a little bit kind of innocent at first glance, but the idea that it is forced upon someone is a little bit disconcerting. But before we get into the technicalities of how this ability might work, I think it's definitely worth talking about Yuji's possible lineage. This idea of him having this overwhelming physical strength, something superhuman, and the 1 in a million of eating the Sukuna finger and surviving, I would argue that it's actually harder to argue for the fact that Yuji is just a normal person. Not to mention the fact that the grandfather's last words, he was about to tell Yuji something about his parents, but Yuji sort of cut him off a couple times even. So whether it's actually the grandfather who was perhaps a jutsu sorcerer himself, or it's more the parents, it's still kind of unclear. There's definitely something to suggest that the parents are somehow involved, and perhaps it is the grandfather as well. There is this lineage. And, you know, it would very much fall in line with the narrative that we see in Shonen Jump so often, this idea of the main character having some sort of special lineage. It certainly wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility in Jujutsu Kaisen as well. So maybe it is more appropriate for us to say that Yuji has some sort of heavenly restriction, as they call it in the series. Something along the lines of Maki or Toji or Muta, for example. So let's go with this theory that it is indeed the grandfather who passed on this curse, for lack of a better word, this kind of esoteric ability, which we don't know quite how it was passed on to Yuji, but for the sake of this theory, let's go on with this. So what are the actual conditions that need to be met to activate this ability? And I say conditions very, very specifically instead of something like the order or something like that, because in both cases, Yuji did not do it out of his own volition, right? It was sort of happenstance that it happened in both cases. Perhaps the first condition that needs to be met, so to speak, is, as we've kind of talked about before, that Yuji has to sort of be on death's doorstep, so to speak, kind of beaten half to death, as ridiculous as that sounds, because that would go along with the narrative that we have, that this whole idea of death for Yuji is very important in terms of the narrative as well, right? An improper death versus a proper death. This idea of when he goes out, he wants to be surrounded by those who care for him and he cares about. A power, a curse that has something to do with him having to be near death is certainly possible. And then the second condition that needs to be met is answering a question. Now this kind of seems, well, what does that even mean? But in both cases, with Todo and Choso, in the case of Todo, he asks Yuji, what type of girls are you into? You know, his famous line, and Yuji answers, I like tall girls with big butts. And in the case of Choso, Choso asks about his departed brothers Kichizu and Eso, asking whether they said anything before they went out, and Yuji says, well, they didn't really say anything, but there were tears shed. So in both cases, Yuji is beaten half to death as well as answering a question. Now the order was different though. In the case of Todo basically is beating Yuji's face into a tree. And although Yuji does sort of get up, it's worth mentioning that he really isn't out for the count, so to speak. However, he probably did see the Grim Reaper in the distance for a second there for sure. But then it's when Todo asks the question, what type of girls do you like? And Yuji answers the question, boom, the ability activates. And in the case of Choso, it's the other way around. Choso starts the fight by asking Yuji this question, and then not until he beats Yuji to a pulp does the ability activate. And I think we definitely have to kind of talk about what the question is all about too. Is it just a random question? Can you just ask, oh, what day of the week is it? Is it Wednesday? And if Yuji is beaten half to death, does it activate? I don't think obviously that's the way that it works. There's a specific sort of condition that needs to be met with this question and answer. And in both cases, the common thread that we can see is that they elicited very strong emotional response and were indeed very important to the person asking the question. In the case of Todo, this idea of what type of girls do you like is indeed very, very important to Todo. In the case of Choso, this question about his brothers is very, very important to him, and Yuji was able to elicit this kind of emotional response. But perhaps it's more than just emotional response. I think it is more along the lines of empathy, if we're to get really specific. Because in the case of Todo, Yuji coincidentally answers exactly what Todo wants to hear, kind of has this moment of empathy with Todo. And although in the case of Choso, they are sort of enemies and it's not quite what Choso really wants to hear, so to speak, there is perhaps this moment of empathy that is sparked between the two. So perhaps the ability is more appropriately called this sort of empathy, that this friendship trigger is activated by empathy. And this idea of empathy for the main character would be very appropriate for a Shonen Jump protagonist, right? We've seen this time and time again with characters such as Naruto or Ichigo or, Midoriya, for example. Characters who have this kind of uncanny kindness about them, and they've gone through a lot themselves, and they're able to see other people for, what they're worth and share this sort of empathy, right? So it would be very appropriate for Yuji as well, someone who is very kind and is able to sort of relate to other people based on kind of the struggles that he's had and sort of the what his motivations are. And I think definitely there might be a third condition that needs to be met as well. If we can't be exactly sure if this is a condition. However, if we are to kind of pinpoint one more common thread between Choso and Todo, it is that they both had this sort of, I wouldn't say animosity towards Yuji. However, they saw Yuji as a enemy, as a target. I think it's worth mentioning because one of the loopholes perhaps we'll talk about later is the fact that who does this ability activate against? Does it work against friends and stuff as well? So now that we have kind of a good idea of what this ability is perhaps all about, what are the consequences, right? What are the possible disadvantages to having an ability like this? How does it affect other people and Yuji himself? Now, the fact that Yuji isn't able to use this ability based on his kind of own will, or he's not aware of this ability anyways, is in fact very disconcerting. And maybe down the line, he'll become aware of this ability and be able to use it or not use it on his own will. But for right now, the fact that he's unable to use it consciously, pun sort of intended, is very disconcerting because of the repercussions. The idea of increasing friends at first glance seems kind of, oh, that's great, friendship and all that. However, we've seen in the case of Todo, it's consumed a significant part of his life. Even in a recent chapter, we've seen that Todo now has a locket around his neck where he had two of the most important people in his life, Takada-chan as well as Yuji, around his neck now, signifying to us this is how important, this is how much it's consumed a part of Todo's life. Now, there are worse fates than seeing someone becoming a friend or being infatuated with someone. However, it is very consuming. Who knows how much of Todo's life it actually affects, and so that is very disconcerting. And the fact that it still seems to be activated within Todo is a big problem. He activated at the Goodwill event arc, yet here we are at the Shibuya incident, and Todo is still sort of brainwashed, for a lack of a better word. And the way that we saw it affect Choso is cause for alarm as well. With Choso, he wasn't able to process it quite as smoothly as Todo was. In the case of Choso, he was driven, seems sort of crazy, and we haven't seen Choso since then. So what is the difference between Todo and Choso here? We have to remember that with Choso, he is half human, half curse. So I think that is the big difference. Choso had such an adverse reaction to the situation. And perhaps this is also evidence to suggest that if Yuji were to, if the conditions were coincidentally met against a just straight up curse, someone like Mahito or, I don't know, Sukuna even, would it work against them? However, in the case of Sukuna, we have to remember that he used to be human, so perhaps it would elicit a similar response like Joso. And of course, we have to talk about what really are the benefits. It's quite a blissful ability for Yuji, the fact that he's able to gain more friends along the way. However, it is a little sinister because it's not quite the same way that Luffy, for example, gains friends, right? We know in One Piece that Luffy's true greatness lies in the fact that he's able to increase the number of allies based on his determination and personality and things like that, that others are sort of drawn to him by their own will. But in the case of Yuji, it kind of flips that on its head. Yeah, he's able to draw people to his side, however, it's forced. So sort of one of the big twists, perhaps, of Jujutsu Kaisen and this Shonen Jump theme that we've seen time and time again. So it benefits Yuji, sure, but at what cost? And of course, it begs the question if there is a way to sort of deactivate it, so to speak. In the case of Todo, what would be his reaction if he realizes that this whole infatuation with Yuji, calling him brother, their best friends since junior high, was all just a farce? Would Todo still respect Yuji the same way? Now finally, let's get into some of the loopholes with this ability, kind of a little bit taboo, kind of picking through my own theory and possibly collapsing the last however many minutes. We have to start out with the ability itself. What really is it? Is it a curse technique? There's evidence to suggest that it's not. The fact that Gojo looked at Yuji and said, you don't have a curse technique. So is it an actual entity that's attached to Yuji? Sort of like Rika was attached to Yuta. If that were the case, it's hard to believe that no one would notice that this whole time. So is it just some sort of will? What does that even mean? Of course, in Jujutsu Kaisen, there are a lot of things that aren't quite explained yet. So perhaps the most appropriate kind of interpretation is to suggest that it is some sort of esoteric ability which was passed down to Yuji, some sort of latent power, something different, something that we haven't quite seen in the series yet. Something appropriate for the main character, something special. And we also have to ask, why would the grandfather even pass this down to Yuji? We have to remember that when the grandfather died, he didn't know that Yuji was going to become a Jujutsu sorcerer. However, if we are to talk about sort of the lineage and strong evidence suggesting that Yuji's family was perhaps involved in Jujutsu sorcery somehow, at least, that the grandfather did believe that Yuji was destined for that path as well. And the way that the grandfather recognizes this great ability that Yuji has, surely he's seen his physical prowess. He's noticed that Yuji is something special. Perhaps he knew that Yuji was going to become a Jujutsu sorcerer and left him with this gift, this ability, in hopes that Yuji would eventually figure it out or perhaps meet someone that would be able to guide him. Someone like Gojo, for example. However, if we are to assume that it is indeed an ability of the grandfather's, that he sort of passed it down a la One for All in My Hero Academia, why did the grandfather die alone? Now, this could very well be the case because, as we've talked about, the ability is forced upon someone. So perhaps the grandfather has used it before, but eventually ended up alone based on the consequences. Or it could be something a lot more esoteric, that it's not necessarily that the grandfather had this ability, but he sort of created it for Yuji. That, as crazy as this seems, that the grandfather had some sort of ability, perhaps his curse technique was that his final words to someone before holding the hands of the Grim Reaper would become true. Now, like I mentioned before, does this ability work on friends as well? Because it is quite a troublesome ability, and if you're not careful, it could have some serious consequences. This is why I mentioned earlier that perhaps there is a third condition, sort of a fail-safe, that whoever it's being used against has to see Yuji as an enemy. Otherwise, it could be used, unfortunately, against the likes of Fushiguro and Gojo if, for whatever bizarre reason, Yuji were to be beaten half to death by Fushiguro and answer a question which elicits some sort of emotional response from Fushiguro, that it would just activate, right? But yeah, I know it's a lot to sort of wrap your head around. I know there could be a lot more loopholes in my theory and a lot of things that are missing, I'm sure. It has to be. But I want to say thank you so much for taking a little bit of time out of your day to watch me sort of ramble on about this crazy theory of mine. And of course, a lot of other people as well. I'm not claiming that I'm the only one that thinks this way. I'm sure there are a lot of other people that have figured something out along the same lines as well. Yeah, let me know in the comments if you have any ideas yourself, whether I was perhaps missing something, whether you agree, whether you disagree, let me know. And I just want to say thank you so much. We'll see you in the next video. I don't have a drink on me today to do my usual send-off, but hey, let's go with the MC himself, the main man, the topic of the day. And I am here to say, you know how we do. Mata yoroshiku. Alright. See you in the next video.